The contamination, first contact with the impossible. It started at 213 local, west of the Puerto Rico trench. The hydrophones lit like a city switching on. One return, then three, then a continuous track that didn't smear with turbulence and didn't fade with distance. The plotted line kinked, 90 degrees in less than a second, torpedo-killing acceleration with no cavitation bloom on any channel. The watch officer told the junior tech to rerun the filter tree. The printer kept spitting paper. 18 years in, the acoustic analyst, call him Reyes, had heard everything seawater could make. Prop cavitation singing like hail. Snap of shrimp masking a diesel. Seiche hums. Volcano drumming. He'd filed fish schools as noise and flagged a whale as a sub once, learned humility the hard way. That night he squinted at the spectra and wrote 3 words on the margin. Non-ballistic, transmedium. The phrasing was analyst shorthand, not doctrine, a way to mark an object that didn't behave like ordnance or biology. The numbers fought common sense. At 550 knots underwater, drag should climb like a wall. Cavitation should tear a pocket of vapor that screams and shreds material. Every textbook, every URIC chapter, every internal brief on speed limits, all of it said the same thing: water punishes speed. For clarity, any mechanisms discussed in this investigation, bubble phase control, boundary layer manipulation, non-cavitating displacement, are theoretical extensions of known hydrodynamics. We present them as hypotheses consistent with observed patterns, not as confirmed technology. Reyes ran through the checklist: range gating errors, clock drift, sensor crosstalk, aliasing. Then they kicked off a calibration sweep, a clean ping out and back. The array confirmed its own timing to the microsecond. The track didn't move. The instrument error crowd had a point. Hydrophones do lie. Temperature layers bend sound, currents carry noise, and even a loud storm can ghost a return. But the calibration nailed the sound speed profile that night. The thermocline sat where it should. The signal-to-noise ratio was clean. On a second channel, different bearing, the signature appeared with the same velocity solution. 2 ears, same whisper. Unknown to them, across the surface, a patrol craft reported a boil on calm water. No wind, no swell, just a round patch like something exhaled from depth. On the bridge, sunglasses fogged. Then the electronics dimmed in a synchronized brownout the engineer couldn't trace. The radar lost sea clutter, like the ocean went velvet. A petty officer vomited on his boots and swore he'd smelled hot copper. 20 minutes later, their log would read, equipment anomaly, training artifact. Someone told them to write it that way. Back in the shack, Reyes watched the track jog again, 45 degrees, then a deceleration that looked like a cliff. He'd seen missiles bleed speed. This wasn't that. He printed the strip and took it to the watch officer. The officer glanced, closed the folder, and said the word that ends careers: artifact. In that moment, authority didn't investigate, it collapsed into denial. The next morning, Reyes returned to an empty tray. The printout was gone. The server audit showed a 4-minute maintenance window that just happened to overlap the export request. He got reassigned to Environmental Decorrelation Analysis, a job title that means stop asking questions. In his locker, he found a note. Great catch. Stay safe. No signature. Here's the thing. Data metastasizes when you try to cauterize it. Within a week, a civilian array in the Windward Passage flagged a similar signature at lower amplitude. 2 weeks later, a Tonga chromatic deep sensor pinged a fast mover that entered a trench, lost to silence, then exited 2 canyons away with a perfect phase-locked return. The old SOSIS-era logs, digitized and forgotten on a university mirror, held a ghost from decades back. A 200-plus knot transit that nobody could explain then and nobody revisited now. Different hardware, different oceans, the same hard right angles. Reyes still had one artifact that didn't get erased. He'd taken a phone shot of the strip, grainy, skewed, timestamps half cut off. It was enough to reconstruct the slope. He later slid it across a coffee table to a younger analyst who worked modern digital arrays. The younger one ran it against known instrument errors and shook his head. Non-ballistic. Not cavitating. If this is real, it's boundary layer magic. Note, the 550 knot slope is reported as recorded by analysts on the array that night and reconstructed from the surviving strip photo. It should be treated as an anomalous measurement pending independent replication, not a settled performance envelope. Meanwhile, everything on the surface got labeled coincidence. The boil on the water, gas release. The brownout, Generator runtime. The nausea? Seasick. Yet the boat's EM log showed a spike synced to the 2:13 onset. The magnetic anomaly logger, they're mostly for curiosity, twitched. The ship's GPS reported a fractional drift, then corrected, as if it had been politely nudged. If that can happen to a trained bridge crew, it can happen to anyone crossing a quiet patch at night. 3 days later, a diver team doing a routine tethered check near the shelf break radioed back a strange complaint. No depth change on the gauge, no current shift, but they felt a bone-deep pressure, like standing under a heavy ceiling. 2 divers surfaced with headaches and a metallic taste. The tender chalked it up to CO2, swapped tanks, and sent them back down. The symptoms faded when the hydrophones went quiet. Early suppression came fast and tidy. The internal incident report was stamped training artifact before the witness statements were complete. The calibration sweep that killed the error hypothesis was split into 2 files, neither of which showed the full picture alone. Rhea's request to retain the raw waves got bounced to a compliance address that redirected to a dead mailbox. This wasn't a conspiracy board. You could see the seams where a human being cut corners, and someone else told them it was fine. What nobody knew at the time was that other trenches had started whispering the same pattern. The Puerto Rico line wasn't a fluke, it was an introduction. In a quiet office stateside, a retired cable engineer kept a private archive of noise maps. He'd labeled certain corridors "don't bother zones," places where telecom data got squirrely for no reason. He would later flip through Rhea's photo, then pull a transparency from the 90s and overlay it. The lines rhymed. This was the moment everything changed for Reyes. He'd gone from measuring the ocean to realizing the ocean might be managed. He didn't have a theory. He had a stack of negatives where signals should be. And when you see absence behave like a machine, you stop calling it nature. While the paperwork settled, the whispers grew. A watchstander in Guam heard a low-modulated tone just before a sonar screen went gray. A trawler off Dominica crossed a patch of water where the sea lost its sound, and the crew went quiet without knowing why. The word contamination started to show up in emails, not biological, not chemical, but operational. As if a logic had entered the water and everything human was now downstream of it. The file didn't close. It spread. The pattern emerges, trenches, arcs, and gaps. While Reyes tried to keep his head down, a different kind of map started taking shape. One built from whispers, skipped returns, and corridors where sound went to die. It wasn't a single dot on a chart. It was a lattice. Puerto Rico was only the first light. Then the Mariana. Then Tonga Chromatic. Each with the same strange choreography. Sudden ingress, a hard-angled traverse inside the trench's shadow, and an exit through a narrow mouth like a keyed doorway. From a distance, the cluster map looked like someone had traced patrol routes on a globe, broad arcs sweeping between basin edges, meeting at choke points where the seafloor drops in a clean wall. The arcs had rhythm, not constant, not random. Windows opened and closed. In Puerto Rico, strong signatures favored pre-dawn on even-numbered days for 3 weeks, then slipped to afternoons like a schedule change. In Mariana, the pattern inverted. Meanwhile, shipping lanes stayed busy, oblivious. But naval exercises in those windows quietly underperformed. Range tests missed benchmarks, sonars. They correlated. ASW drills postponed for weather under clear skies. Civilian eyes kept adding color. Fishermen along the Mona Passage reported silent upwellings that left a glassy ring on rough water. GPS units drifted just enough to make a net miss its set, then snapped back like a leash tightened. Off Tonga, longliners swore a wall of fog arrived with no wind and sat like a curtain until their engine instruments jittered, then cleared. When you pinned those accounts to coordinates and times, they fell along the same corridors Reyes had circled with his thumbnail on a printout nobody was supposed to see. The technical cross-check was the part that made old hands frown. Sosis-era paper logs, grainy, cryptic, annotated in pencil, showed fast movers that transit from abyss to shelf and back without the acoustic mess a supercavitating object would leave. Post-2010's digital arrays, with very different filters and clocks, showed the same shape in velocity space. A clean slope, a hinge, a vanish. 2 eras. 2 toolkits. The same ghost handwriting. Here's where the pattern sharpened. One patrol arc in the Tonga Chromatic set always ended near a dead zone in undersea cable diagnostics. Telecom engineers called it an occlusion, a patch where throughput got squirrely, error checking spiked, and automated systems quietly rerouted traffic around a small black square on a network map. The square never sat still. It moved with the same tempo as the trench track. Nobody at the cable company would comment. Someone sent a reply with 2 words: known issue. What nobody knew at the time was that the occlusion wasn't passive. In a quiet lab attached to a coastal university, a grad student noticed that passive acoustic recorders went noiseless not only when the corridor closed, but also 5 minutes before a known patrol window started. It was like a room clearing its throat before a meeting. Active sonar in those periods didn't return garbage. It returned velvet, flat, comfortable zeros, as if the ocean wanted to be easy to read while telling you nothing. Meanwhile, across the world, a NATO exercise in the Norwegian Sea recorded a gap, a literal hole in the operational picture. P-8s flew racetrack patterns and found no useful returns in a wedge that should have been loud with training targets. The after-action notes called it environmental decorrelation, a phrase that does a lot of work without saying anything. The timing overlapped, almost to the hour, with a Tonga occlusion shift. If you lined up the events by Greenwich time, you saw a wave move around the world in hops. Corridor opens, corridor dims, gap blooms elsewhere. Not a storm, a schedule. And when authorities can't even name the clock running their sensors, you feel the ground give way beneath expertise. Unknown to them, across town from Reyes, the retired cable engineer opened his drawer and pulled the transparency again. He laid it over a bathymetric chart and sighed. The ingress nodes lined up with trench heads, fracture zones, and canyon mouths, geological structures that act like acoustic lenses and pressure gates. The egress points favored shelf breaks near cable trunks and naval corridors. It was a design that used geology the way a city uses ridgelines and rivers. Not a base as a building, a base as a geometry. The first internal cliffhanger arrived in an email with 3 attachments: a heat map of null events, a shipping density overlay, and a small square blacked out near the Puerto Rico trench's northeastern spur. The sender didn't explain the blackout. They didn't need to. That square sat exactly where the cable data went weird and where a fast mover track had vanished twice in 1 month. A square that moved shouldn't exist. Yet there it was, present by being missing. This was the moment everything changed for the skeptics who'd stayed quiet. Natural explanations, internal waves, eddies, thermocline tricks, don't follow corridors around the world and show up on fiber diagnostics. Volcanic microseisms don't open gaps right when an exercise begins and close them as the debrief starts. Noise doesn't anticipate you. Something was shaping the ocean's soundscape with intent enough to set hours and draw lines. While that was happening in New York, a Caribbean ferry crossed one of the mapped arcs at dusk. Passengers took photos of the horizon and didn't notice anything unusual, except one: a wall of fog that stood like a fence half a mile off, then slid sideways and dissolved. The ferry's captain checked his chronometer later and found it lagged by 31 seconds. He reset it, shrugged, and logged nothing. But his AIS track shows a tiny kink where none should be. On the map, it falls exactly on the line Reyes drew. The ocean was no longer just water. It had lanes, and something was patrolling them. The first roadblock, the silence field. The first time they named it, they chose a phrase that didn't scare the lawyers: acoustic null. Out at the edge of Puerto Rico's shelf, a wedge of water went velvet black to active sonar. Not noisy, not cluttered, just gone. Destroyers painted the void with pings and got back a calm, flat floor like a studio backdrop. Sub-crews called it the curtain. Captains rerouted. Insurers quietly added a surcharge for hulls transiting that lane and asked no follow-up questions in writing. Here's why that matters. In a world run by sensors, blindness is an attack. Subs trust the thermocline, the math of layers and bounce. When the null sat across a contested approach, every assumption snapped. You couldn't certify a safe depth. You couldn't hold a firing solution. You couldn't even argue with it, because the returns looked clean. Too clean. The wedge turned planned patrols into dice throws. A carrier group shifted 30 miles east for sea state. The real reason rode the hush channel. Null persists. Avoid. The first theories were polite. Thermocline. Internal waves. Microbubbles. Good explanations, until the field moved against prevailing currents. Track it for a week and the wedge drifted upslope, nosed into a canyon mouth, and parked where an ingress corridor had lit up 2 nights earlier. When the current flipped, the wedge didn't. Someone said advective decoupling, in a brief, and got a nod. Then the field reversed direction mid-tide, and the room went quiet. Meanwhile, unknown to the ships above, A contracted dive team ran an inspection inside the edge of that velvet. No depth change, same nitrogen load. But every diver on the line felt a weight that wasn't there, bone-deep pressure, like a hand on the sternum. 2 tapped out early with headaches. Back on deck, 1 tasted metal and couldn't shake it for an hour. The tender checked their scrubbers and replaced O-rings, then sent a 3rd pair down. Same report, same taste. The moment the hydrophones logged the null relaxing, the symptoms faded. The dive supervisor wrote possible CO2 exposure to keep the log tidy and stared at nothing for a long minute. What nobody knew at the time was that a private lab had left a dosimeter running next to their passive array on the coast. It ticked up only during null windows and only inside the wedge footprint, then went flatline normal again. Not ionizing, the lab director insisted later, just energy dense in a way their instrument didn't like. Weeks after they emailed their chart to a Navy liaison, their lease got reviewed, and they started packing boxes. In the paper trail that followed, a phrase appeared and stuck: adaptive suppression field. It showed up in an internal memo with a distribution list blacked out into a rectangle. The language was careful: environmental decorrelation, temporary impairments, localized returns anomalies, but the line that mattered was simple. Field exhibits movement and contraction consistent with targeted shaping. Shaping, as if the water had a user interface. Stakes went from theoretical to personal in a night. A fast attack sub, holding at periscope depth, eased toward the edge of the null to test it. The sonar picture smoothed out into the same false comfort, and then, as if someone slid a slider, the ocean returned in a soft rush. Contacts bloomed. A second later, a low tone sat under the noise floor like a heartbeat and nudged the crew into silence. No panic, just a hush. The captain ordered a lateral shift. The field slid with them, keeping its distance. Then it pinched, tightened into a smaller wedge that sat, perfect and polite, over a coordinates cluster nobody would talk about afterward. The insurers whispered about uninsurable corridors. Actuaries hate unknowns. Blind spots in the sea lanes became liability traps. Freight companies got emails recommending alternate routes with no mention of physics, only environmental constraints. In the same week, a Navy after-action note used the phrase, operationally degraded volume, which means the same thing with a badge. Meanwhile, fishing radio chatter turned practical. Don't set nets there after dusk. GPS gets squirrely in the elbow. Fog wall rolled in like a fence. Put the pins on a chart, and you trace the null's edges. The thing behaved with manners. It didn't smash boats or snap masts. It made space, carved it out neatly, and held it. Sailors joked that the ocean had a doorman now. Jokes are how you cope when your body learns to comply before your mind catches up. Theory fought data until data won. Thermocline excuses failed because the wedge ignored wind. Gas plumes didn't ride up canyon walls and hold a straight edge. Military jamming doesn't move with seafloor geometry and leave no RF footprint. What they did see was consistent. A pre-event quieting, a flattening to black velvet, and a controlled release like the room clearing its throat and then going back to normal. This was the first roadblock. Not a wall you crash into, a gate you're meant to notice. It contracted, then pinpoints formed over a coordinates cluster that sat at the intersection of patrol arcs, cable occlusions, and trench heads. Nobody in uniform wanted to say it out loud, but everyone understood the message. The field wasn't hiding. It was drawing a circle, and inside that circle, the ocean belonged to someone else. The investigation, mapping the hidden machine. To understand why the field drew circles where it did, we had to stack every scrap of data on one table. Reyes met the retired cable engineer in a diner with bad coffee and better privacy. Between them, trench bathymetry, hydrophone logs, cable error heat maps, and a grad student's spreadsheet of silence windows. On a fresh chart, they layered patrol arcs, ingress nodes, and null wedges. The mess turned into geometry. What nobody knew at the time was that the fields didn't float alone. They nested. A broad, low-amplitude quieting would sweep first, like a broom. Inside it, a tighter acoustic velvet, the null. Within that, a razor-thin line where tone events showed up on passive gear, the do not enter, that nobody could decode. Layered fields, synchronized like a machine booting up, and always oriented to trench mouths and shelf breaks. It wasn't random. It was a grid hugging geology. Reyes didn't say base. He said system. The engineer nodded and traced finger arcs along fracture zones. Trenches aren't just deep, they're structural,